The poem we're looking at today, as you can see there, is The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. The question that we really need to answer in order to understand this poem, why it was written, and to a certain extent, even the event itself that the poem is written about, is why is there this fascination for that most romantic of military actions, the cavalry charge. We see in film and TV and novels a continued fascination, a continued depiction in all sorts of historical dramas, with this being a sort of moment of glory and a moment of kind of triumph. Why is that the one that's continually held up? That kind of fascination with the cavalry charge and that kind of depiction of its heroism and the magnitude of it as an event actually goes some way to explaining why this event that the poem is written about even happened in the first place. But to understand that, we need to understand a little bit more about the context of when the event took place. So we're going to have a little look at the Crimean War itself. So the Crimean War basically takes place between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The war happens because the Ottoman Empire transferred the protectorship of all the Christians within their empire from the Russian Empire to the French, who of course are much further away. The war basically happens in that small peninsula there that's known as the Crimea, and Britain get involved because of their imperial kind of concerns. They don't want another superpower in Europe, and the French are really keen to kind of up their prestige, so this is important to them. So really the kind of focal point of the war is that peninsula there that's called the Crimean Peninsula, and it all kicks off in a place called Sinope, which is a port in the Ottoman Empire where the entire kind of Turkish fleet are destroyed by the Russians. Then the fighting transfers to the Crimean Peninsula. There are three kind of main areas of conflict in the Crimean Peninsula during this war. There's one that's a little bit further north on the coast, and then there's two that are further down south. So the first one is this kind of not the one I've done there. That's that one there. That place called Alma. That's on September the 20th, 1854. There's a battle there, and then the action shifts much further down south to the Battle of Balaclava, which is where the charge of the Light Brigade actually happens, where this British military action takes place, and that's on October the 25th, 1854. Sebastopol is probably the most famous of the kind of the war zones from the Crimean War, and that fighting there nearly goes on for a year. So it's important for us now to kind of meet the people involved. So the first person we need to know about is a chap called Captain Nolan. Captain Nolan is a cavalry officer. He is a little bit older than most people who have the same rank as him, so he's kind of a little bit frustrated. He wants to be doing more fighting than he is. And he's working as an aide-de-camp, which means that he transfers messages from the commander to other officers. So although he's not as high-ranking as some of the other officers, he sort of plays a more important role insofar as he gets messages from one place to the next. The next person we need to kind of be aware of is the commanding officer of the entire Light Brigade. So this person's name is Major General Brudenell. He's also known as the Earl of Cardigan. That's his kind of title outside the military. He's a well-respected, experienced officer who's been fighting for a long time. The final person we need to kind of be aware of is Lieutenant General Bingham, who's also known as the Earl of Lucan. He's the commander of all the cavalry. So although Major General Brudenell is in charge of the Light Brigade, Lieutenant General Bingham is actually in charge of all of the cavalry. So all the cavalry things go through him. So how do we end up in this place where we've got a whole poem written about one cavalry charge that happens in what is also a massive battle? There's loads of other things that happen in the Battle of Balaclava. It's massive. And Sebastopol, the other one that I told you about, I mean, there's so much more conflict there. Lord Raglan, who's actually in charge of the British forces at the Battle of Balaclava, he dies in Sebastopol. And that barely gets a mention. There's nothing really, kind of written down in terms of poems about that. So why is that? Why have we got this event? Why does the charge of the Light Brigade? Why is that something that's just kind of remembered throughout history? Well, here's what happens. So Lord Raglan, who's in charge of the British forces, turns to Captain Nolan, who's his aide-de-camp, who carries his messages for him, and he goes, I want you to deliver these orders. Now, what Raglan can see from the vantage point that he's got, his command point on his hill, is that he can see kind of in the distance there are some Russians. They're near the Light Brigade, and they've captured these Turkish cannon. And they're moving them off the battlefield so they can use them at a future date. And Raglan goes, I'll tell you what, I'll send the Light Brigade. They can just kind of menace them. If they get near enough to them, it'll kind of freak them out. They'll leave the cannon and they'll move away. So he goes, I'll send them there and to stop the Russians capturing that cannon. But I don't want to use the Light Brigade just yet because I'm holding them in reserve. And Nolan, he takes the order. And I'll tell you what the order actually says. The order says, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. So the immediate part there is sort of saying that I want you to follow these orders immediately. It needs to happen straight away. What historians have always said is kind of fascinating about that order is that it doesn't actually contain the word attack. It certainly doesn't contain the word charge, but it doesn't even contain the word attack. What he wants them to do is to kind of move in such a way that they kind of menace the Russians who are moving them, and they kind of think, well, we need to hold off here, or that all that cavalry is going to come and attack us. So they kind of Raglan doesn't even say, I want you to attack anyone. What happens is Captain Nolan he picks up this order and he rides away and he charges over to see the two commanding officers. And here's the interesting thing: he doesn't give them the order. He holds on to it and he gives them his own verbal interpretation of it. He never actually hands it over. And there's some kind of discussion there. He kind of goes, look, it's quite clear what we have to do. We're supposed to attack. Now, Brudenell and Lucan, they can't actually see the cannons that Raglan is talking about. They can only see Russian cannon at the end of the valley in which the Light Brigade are positioned. They can only see the cannon immediately in front of them. This kind of, like deadly concoction of like incredibly powerful Russian artillery. And they go, well, that's ridiculous. You can't expect us to do that. And Nolan gets quite cross. And he sort of goes, no, you follow your orders. We've got to attack the cannon. So they do. So they charge at this artillery position, and they suffer a huge number of casualties. There's about 600 people in the Light Brigade. There's something like 150 dead and about 120 wounded. So they lose nearly half their number in the space of a few minutes, either to death or to serious injury. So the Light Brigade are half the strength that they are by the end of the battle. Captain Nolan obviously carries a lot of responsibility for this. Raglan, the commander of the British Army, always blamed Lucan. He always blamed Lieutenant General Bingham until his death, which wasn't that much. That much later. He died at Sebastopol. But the interesting thing, of course, about Nolan is that the secret of his interpretation of the order and his intention is in the grave with him, because he dies at the very start of the charge of the Light Brigade. He rides out in front, interestingly, of Brudenell, so he's kind of behind him, and then he rides out in front. He tries to cut across, and there's a soldier who kind of says, this is what he did. He rides out in front of them and he holds his arms like this. He rides a few paces and then drops down dead because an artillery shell has exploded near him. So no one knows what he was going to say or what he was going to do. There's some discussion of whether or not he was going to try and change everyone's mind and get everyone to go back, whether he's changed his mind about wanting the charge to happen, or whether he has kind of, he's realized there was a mistake where he didn't realize there was a mistake before. But it's basically a horrendous mistake. It's a horrendous mistake. It's a stupid, crazy decision. That costs 150 lives and 120 more serious injuries. And it's over in a few minutes as well. That's one of the more sort of powerful things about it. Anyway, so I'm going to show you now a clip from a film that was made about the event in 1968. It's an incredibly well-made film. See if you can spot the sort of the three main kind of protagonists of the event in the film. Yeah, I think it's a really, really good representation. I think it will give you a really good flavour of kind of like, what actually happened.
Will you execute Lord Raglan's orders, my lord? I am waiting.
Captain Nolan, I say if you look before you, you will see neither enemy nor guns. The usefulness of such an order eludes me.
The position, I assure you, is quite clear from where Lord Raglan stands.
Is it?
Is it? Is it? It is! Lord Raglan's orders are that the cavalry should attack immediately!
Attack, sir! Attack, attack, attack! Attack what? Attack where? Guns, Mr. Nolan!
There! There, my lord! There is your enemy! There are your guns!
I suggest, Lord Cardigan, you advance steadily. Keep your men well in hand. If the brigade is handled with control, there should be no useless or unnecessary loss.
Certainly, sir. But allow me to point out to you that the Russians have guns in the valley and batteries and riflemen on each flank. It is contrary to all practice of war for cavalry to charge artillery from the front.
You are quite right, sir. But what choice have we?
We're going, dear friend. Permission to ride with the 17th.
Permission granted, dear friend.
Douglas! Colonel Douglas! I expect your best support.
You shall have it, my lord.
Mind, Douglas? Your best support. Draw! Swords!
At last.
Well, here goes the last of the Brudenells.
The brigade will advance. Trumpet up. Walk!
Oh, kiss me, Jubilee!
That won't do! The wrong way! Alert! The wrong way! Wheel right, my lord! Wheel right! Wheel right! Wheel
What's the matter with Cardigan? Outflank those guns now, damn you, not charge them. He's turning into the wrong valley.
Navadi!
Captain Morris! Do not try to force the pace! And do not try to ride before the leader of the brigade!
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian, reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the light brigade, noble 600.
So here we are. I'm going to talk about language and structure separately, like I did last time. But I think we're going to be a little bit less specific. I'm going to be talking about the poem more as a kind of overall. We've gone now through this, the third poem we're looking at. So in terms of making those kind of annotations and looking out for those poetic features, I'm hoping that you might be able to sort of start doing that for yourselves. But we'll kind of walk you through this one anyway. So the first thing I think is worth talking about is when Alfred Lord Tennyson has written it. So he is, at the time of writing the poem, he is poet laureate. So he's basically the country's official poet. The poem is published on the 9th of December 1854. He writes it on the 2nd of December. So there's only a week between him writing it and it being published in the newspaper. It is rumoured that he wrote it in a few minutes after reading an account of what had happened. And of course, if you think, it happens in October, that news getting back to Britain is going to take a bit of a while. So he immediately has a response to this story that he's heard. And obviously, he won't have heard it in the detail that we can now sit back in 2020 and look at it in. But let's start here. So we've got half a league, half a league, half a league onward. The very opening of the poem is this incredible amount of repetition. I think that this repetition here, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, I think it serves two purposes. I think the repetition, on the one hand, is showing us the kind of the anticipation of the soldiers. The idea the order's been given, they're half a league away. That's the distance. Half a league is a distance, and that's how far they are. They're half a league, half a league, half a league onward. They're moving on. But I also think there's something in that kind of hard, plosive G sound. There's something onomatopoeic about it. It's like the horse's hooves kind of just pattering on the kind of compacted, cold Crimean autumn earth. And I think that there's something in suggesting that actually the poem, if we talk about structure, if we look at how we've got the same structure to a stanza here, and there and there and there, but then they kind of become a little bit longer, and then we have this sort of prematurely finished stanza here, which again is a sort of a structural metaphor, I think, in the same way that it was at the end of Remains, that premature ending. And I also think in this one, it's not just a structural metaphor, but the poet has changed the structure for emphasis. You know, that shorter structure there kind of is emphasizing something to us. We'll talk about what that emphasis is, but I think this final stanza, in many ways, to me, is actually the kind of, is like a condensed version of the poem. But we'll look at that. We'll look at that later, and we'll carry on here looking at the first one. So half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death. So death is capitalized. Death is also capitalized here. Death is also capitalized here. Hell is capitalized here. Death is also capitalized in the fifth stanza. So there's something, and hell, of course, is capitalized as well. So there's something about this capitalization that's going on of death twice in that stanza. There's something about the capitalization here, the valley of death. It's a biblical reference, of course. I believe it's Psalm 28, but I will check that. In fact, I will check that now. I'll just go on to Google. Psalm 8. Psalm, maybe it's a different one. Valley of the Shadow. Death. Psalm 23, my goodness, forgive me. Worth looking up. Yes, Psalm 23. So this idea of the valley of death, it's almost as if they're sort of religiously preparing themselves for death. And I also think as well there's something here in the word the 600. The pre-fronted verb as well here, I think, it's this tone, it's this sort of Shakespearean, it's epic, it's like an epic poem. Even the numbering of the stanzas kind of makes it this more kind of monumental, more magnificent occasion. And they're not any 600, they are the 600. It's that single word is immortalizing them. It immortalizes the soldiers. I think as well, there's something with the biblical reference and the numbering of the stanzas that's almost kind of, I'm going to use the word hymnal, almost like a hymn. There's something biblical about it. It's almost like this is sort of the biblical references, the numbering of the stanzas, the structure of the stanzas, the the sort of slightly archaic turn of phrase, the archaic syntax. The archaic syntax. I think so. The archaic kind of sentence structure. I think that is sort of creating this religious kind of reverential tone. As well, forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. I think there's something in the he that sort of is deliberately ambiguous and yet at the same time sort of vaguely specific. It's both things at once. It's sort of saying it's generally someone who was in charge. What I also think Tennyson is doing is he's refusing to give any glory to an individual. He's refusing to say one person did particularly well. He talks about the 600. So he's giving it to the group of soldiers. He's not giving it to the officers. This is a poem. This is a poem dedicated to the bravery of the rank and file soldier, of the individual, of the sort of the low ranking soldiers. So forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew some one had blundered. And again, there's this thing with the word one. It's not. It's sort of ambiguous and specific at the same time. So it's to do with the officer class, and it's almost as if they're playing God, because they're kind of making these decisions for the soldiers, and we can see this in this section here. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. And here the repetition is almost symbolic of the class system, because it's sort of saying, the repetition goes, you can't do this, you can't do that, and you can't do that. If you're working class, you're bottom of the rung, you're just a standard soldier. Off you go, fight and die. You can't choose what you do. You can't, you can't fight back. You can't do anything like that. And it's not though the soldier knew. So here, when he says the soldier knew, he's kind of tapping into that thing of this idea that the rank of our soldiers know this is stupid. They know this is ridiculous. There is a kind of echo later in the First World War of that kind of thing of getting out of the trench and marching slowly towards the machine guns. There's something that's an echo of this in that moment. And again, this rode the 600, the repetition here, rode the 600, rode the 600, rode the 600, and then here we get not the 600. So that is our old friend parallelism and deviation, which we learned from last time. That's our old friend there. So something being the same. And actually, if you look, it goes row the 600, row the 600, row the 600, not the 600, left of 600, and then noble 600. But we'll talk about this final stanza in a lot more detail, and we'll give that its own little chat. So third stanza, we've kind of got this sense that we're kind of readying for the charge. We're beginning. We kind of the horses start to walk forward. You saw in that video how the cavalry charge kind of gains momentum, and then here we're kind of cantering. We're moving a bit faster, and now we're kind of full gallop. So again, this repetition here, it's onomatopoeic as well. But it's more than just onomatopoeia here. It's also this kind of sense that kind of emphasizing the stupidity and also the vulnerability. Emphasis on vulnerability. This idea that, so there are cannon everywhere. It's not like one cannon that they've got to try and avoid. I mean, they are all around them. They are everywhere. This is an absolutely moronic thing to do. And I think that as well, this kind of the onomatopoeia isn't just for the guns, it isn't just for the hooves. It's the whole sensory experience. It's the whole, what does it feel like to be there? What does it sound like to be there? Tennyson's trying to recreate this for us. He's trying to recreate this. I think it's interesting as well. He has all these contractions all the way through. There's some up there as well. Stormed at, we'll talk in a second. Flashed and flashed as they turned in air. Volleyed and thundered. Stormed at. I think he's kind of speeding things up. It's all about pace. It's all about rhythm. It's all about speed. It's like the whole poem is itself a charge. And you heard when we had that reading from Holly McNish that came over the film that I showed you. There's a sense that it kind of tumbles out, this poem. It once you've let it out, you can't stop it. The speed that it manages to kind of garner as it goes on is something to behold. Anyway, so we've got stormed at, and stormed at. We've also got thundered. So storm and thunder. There's these kind of references to nature, and I think it's almost as if sort of the power of nature. It's overpowering. You can't fight nature. It's overpowering. It's natural. But there's also this sense, isn't there, that humans will always fight no matter what. That men always get into these conflicts. We've also got this wonderful personification: jaws of death, mouth of hell, as if they're fighting a sentient being. And I think that's what kind of adds to the drama of it, is that Tennyson's recognised that charging at cannon is one thing, but cannons are machines. So in order to kind of get more of a sense of drama, more of a sense of kind of competition, more of a sense of of conflict, really, he's personifying the cannon into death and into hell and jaws and mouth, and the sentience creates a kind of sense of drama. Anyway, I just want to share with you before we move on to these next stanzas here. So there's this wonderful quote. There's this French soldier called Marshal Pierre Bosquet. So Marshal's his title, Marshal Pierre Bosquet, and he was there and he watched the charge. And this is what he had to say about it. And he said, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre, c'est de la folie," which means it's magnificent. But it's not war, it's madness. And I just thought before we kind of go into the kind of the second half of the poem, it's worth thinking about that. So moving on to looking at this kind of the second half of the poem, and as I say, we'll reserve some special time for this final stanza because that ties very nicely into the purpose of the poem. So here we are. It's now as if the cavalry have reached. They've reached the guns, which is of course what they eventually did manage to do. But there was a lot of Russian support by that point anyway. So they flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in there, sabering the gunners there, charging an army. This kind of again this this metaphor. They're not really charging the entire Russian army. This is just one part of the battle, but this metaphor. It's kind of what's quite interesting as well is it's not saying charging the Russians or it's charging an army. It's this sort of small group of men are kind of taking on a wider task, and it's almost about it's almost a metaphor for kind of confronting something larger. It's a metaphor for confronting death, the class system. They're confronting something larger. They're sort of fighting. They're charging an army. It's ceased to be about Britain and it's ceased to be about Russia. Although actually, when you have a look, nothing anywhere really suggests this is about a pride of Britain. There's a bit here about Cossack and Russian. But really, apart from that, it's not. This isn't about glory of Britain. This is just about the Light Brigade. It's just about these 600. And again, while all the world wondered. Now, I think we've got this this kind of alliteration here, this consonant, while the world wondered. But they're quite soft sounds. But I think the alliteration masks a great anger. Tennyson writes this poem quickly. He writes this poem quickly, he gets it published quickly. He is an angry man. And his alliteration here, it's a soft sound, charging an army while all the world wondered. And it's soft and it's gentle. But actually what he's saying is, literally everyone was questioning this decision. How on earth did this happen? Would this have happened somewhere else? Would this have happened in another army? Would another army just have blindly followed the sort of the orders that came from above with the same kind of sense of duty? And I think he's questioning things, and I think that this poem is often, for my money anyway, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me, this poem is often erroneously suggested to be a very patriotic, proud poem. I don't think it is. I think it is literally just about the Light Brigade. I think it is just about some brave people who had to go through something, and the fact that they did the best they could in the circumstances. So plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. And again, this kind of plunging, this sort of plunging, it's this idea of stepping into something. It's throwing yourself into something completely, isn't it? Right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke. I think also it's quite interesting because we've got both of these verbs we wouldn't necessarily associate with war. Plunging is sort of like jumping into water, and a reel actually is a type of dance. So if you're reeling, it's sort of like, it might be if you've been sort of punched, but it also a reel is a kind of is a sort of short folk tune that you would do a dance to. So I think there's something there, and and the sabre stroke shattered and sundered, and again we've got onomatopoeia, kind of trying to give us the sensory experience of being there. So Tennyson is again trying to create what it's like for us there. Then they rode back, but not the 600. And again, not is repeated. He uses repetition very, very effectively and very, very often in this poem as well. But this is where we come into this parallelism and deviation. Now we've got not the 600. Now there's an ambiguity here as well, because it says reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Now the they is quite important actually. If the they is the Russians retreating, then he's saying that normal people would retreat. That's sort of the way of looking at this. The first way is saying look, other people have retreated, but the 600 they did not retreat. The other way of looking at it is saying, well, actually, if the they is referring to the Light Brigade, then it's saying that not 600 of them came back. So looking here at the fifth stanza, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them. Again, we've got this repetition. It's the same as it was in the third stanza here. It's the same sound, but also that word cannon 6 times we have that. You know, for this first three lines, so first three lines there, first three lines there, and again, I think it's this sense of the repetition, the kind of, it's exaggerating the sensory experience, but it's also kind of making us think of how many there were. It is excessive because it's a massive experience. So I think that's a huge. I think that's a huge thing. Volleyed and thundered again, stormed and thundered again, like it was down here. Thundered, stormed at. Here we've got thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. The repetition of the same thing. It's happening over and over and over again. Those cannon are reloading. They're firing. They're reloading. They're firing. There's loads of them. There's no. It's not like, you know. It's this sense that although the charge itself is a matter of minutes, the sort of what it feels like to be in that is that it's so much longer, and I think that's something that Tennyson really gets across very well indeed. While horse and hero fell, so this is the first time he's really explicit about what they are. You know, he sort of said, "While horse and hero fell, they that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600." And again, I think he repeats these words. There's something, it becomes epic. The repetition, the syntax, the archaic syntax creates this kind of epic poem. Again, we've got jaws of death, we've got mouth of hell. This personification is once again repeated, and again, it's to do with, you know, the drama of sort of conscience versus conscience. It's two different consciences fighting each other. The battle is not man versus machine. The battle is man versus creature versus demon. It's man versus death. It's man versus hell. In a sense, he's sort of saying, you know, can you come back from certain death? He's totally and utterly in awe of these men. Which brings us to the last stanza. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. So, why do I think this last stanza is so powerful? Well, to be honest with you, there's a variety of reasons. The first thing is that I think it's a neat summary of everything that he said so far. So I think, when can their glory fade? You know, that's his big question, isn't it? He's going, this is incredible. When will people stop learning about this? When will people stop listening to this? Oh, the wild charge they made. The oh here, it's really dramatic. It's that kind of that Shakespearean oh. It's the sense that it's a massive expression of emotion. It shows you how emotional this is for him. This is a hugely emotional experience for him. The wild charge, and again, it's this sense a little bit like when we were talking about that word savage with Mr. Hyde. It's something that's out of control, unhinged, of kind of being throwing away their social kind of constraints. It's this kind of lack of control, and there is a sense of lack of control. You know, these decisions that were made were terrible. You know, there was no control exercised, and if you think about the bizarreness of the way that message moves from one person to another, you know, someone gives someone a piece of paper, someone else gets on a horse and rides there. You know, there's so much that can go wrong there. We also have this repetition of all the world wondered. And it shows you that Tennyson himself is wondering, but he's also saying that no one can understand this. There's an anger to this. There's a very real anger, and there's a sense of there's an intensity to what Tennyson feels. But for me, the biggest part of this poem is these last two lines, and I really feel very strongly that it's actually quite an emotional moment reading these lines when you truly understand what those lines mean. They're imperatives, aren't they? You know, if we go back to when we were looking at Inspector Calls and the types of sentences that people use, these are imperatives. These are instructions. But who are they instructions for? Let's just pause for a little minute, and we'll go to the whiteboard, which I've managed to find, which I've got from my brother, and we'll look at what we think the purpose of this poem is. I think you can sort of see what I've written there. I'll go over it again. I've written purpose here. What is the purpose of the poem is kind of what we're emphasising. I put those last two lines of that final stanza up there as well. I think we need to bear them in mind. Okay, so I think there's kind of two kind of strands of looking at the purpose, because, like we discussed with Remains, in order to get to kind of the crux of the purpose of a poem, sometimes you need to kind of dissect the tone first. And I think there are two sort of tones, two kind of halves to it. The text there, but there's two kind of halves to it. You've got this kind of patriotic. You see that? You see that? Do it darker. You've got the patriotic. No, is this a celebration of Britain? Is this a celebration of British things? Is this a celebration of the British military? Well, there are things that suggest it's patriotic. For starters, the patriotic tone kind of comes out in some of these things. Sort of like the Valley of Death, forward, charge for the guns. They're all sort of big, bold, brave statements. Forward, the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? No. Was there a man dismayed? Was there a man dismayed? This rhetorical question. This rhetorical question sort of suggests that no one was dismayed because they're British and they're brave and they're not worried by these things. But actually, it's not really about that, because it's not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. So the next part slightly debunks that patriotic tone, but it is there. It is a celebration of those things. Honour the charge they made. Honour that imperative that's repeated. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600. And also you get these other repetitions as well. The bit where they're sort of, the sabre stroke shattered and sundered. The Cossack and Russian, they reeled. The kind of the enemy reeled. We also get a sense of patriotic tone from their sort of charging an army. That's just how brave they are. There is also the possibility that the patriotic tone comes in All the World Wondered. Because there is a sort of a little sprinkling of pride at the idea that no one could understand how people were brave enough and mad enough to do this. And there is that kind of sense of being proud at the British soldiers who are brave enough to do something, and everyone's going, whoa, how is this happening? How are you doing that? Well, they're brave enough to do it. There's a sort of pride there. But I think really we need to look at the purpose. We need to think about this kind of the idea that the tone might not be patriotic. It actually might be cynical. There's an element of a cynical tone, isn't there? There's this idea actually that there's a sort of frustration and there's an anger, and it comes through in a lot of those places. While all the world wondered, I think as well that, as well as being patriotic, I think there's also the sense that that's very much a cynical thing. I think as well, the Valley of Death. It's as though the officers know that this is pointless, that they're all going to die. There's a sense that, sort of like you made them charge into the Valley of Death. Why have you done that? There's an anger, there's a cynicism there. Also, I mean, there's not to section, all of that, and the repetition of that, it's so cynical, it's so angry, it's so frustrated with the way that the world is. I think also the final one I would kind of mention, where is it now? No, the wild, yeah. So I would say, the wild charge, because it's this word wild. If we think back to our knowledge of Victorian Britain, we think back to all that context that we did for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The idea of being wild is not a positive one. It's not a good one. You follow orders, which is what they've done, but also you follow protocol. You follow rules. You do what is expected of you. You do the right thing. Everyone has there's an order, and everyone has a place, and everyone has the right thing to do. And that's not what's happening here. It's a wild charge. Yeah, in the film version, in the 1968 film version, the Chaplain Brunel says it goes against all practice of war. Now, a Victorian would never do anything outside the box. They'd never do any of that. You know, they absolutely follow everything to the letter. We talked about that context, the idea of, you know, British infantrymen wearing red no matter what. It's just what they do. It doesn't matter that we're fighting in the desert and everyone can see us, miles off. It doesn't matter. That's what we do. And so having a wild charge is completely not the sort of the British way. But we're going to focus now on this a little bit. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600. Now, I think it's a real shame that we're not having an opportunity to do this in the classroom together, because I always think this is an amazing moment to share. But in a sense as well, it's quite good that we're doing like this, because then we can kind of reconvene whenever that is. We can talk about this, because I think what you never quite realise when you read this poem through is the importance of these lines. These lines are instructions. They're instructions. They're things that we must do. Honour the charge they made. It's an imperative. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600. So why did Tennyson write this poem? He wrote it so quickly after the actual charge has happened. Well, he wrote it for us. That's who he wrote it for. This is an instruction. It's an instruction for me as a teacher to make sure that you do that, but it's also an instruction for you, even now in 2020, and it will be an instruction in 2120. It will be an instruction in 10 years' time. It will always be an instruction. It's an instruction that lives forever. And because he's written it in this poem, it will always exist. It is an instruction for us. And not only is that the purpose of his poem, it's just for us to honour the charge that they made, honour them, remember the Noble 600, remember them, honour them, like hold on to them and the memory of them. He's done it. He's fulfilled the purpose of his poem, because here I am at home in the midst of a global pandemic, kneeling down next to a dining chair with a whiteboard lent on it, telling you to do this, explaining this to the book, looking at this poem. It's one of the most absolutely incredible things, incredible pieces of writing for that purpose. This poem is fulfilling its purpose. The existence of this video that I've made means that Alfred Lord Tennyson is a success. Whether or not people liked the poem, whether or not you liked the poem, whether or not you do get that sense of what it was like to be there, or whether or not you do understand what the horse's hooves or the cannon sounded like, or whether or not you do, feel that kind of tension between the patriotism and the cynicism, the anger and the sort of the frustration of the loss of life against the kind of the strange admiration for this incredible act of stupidity and bravery, that mixture. We're doing it now. We are. We're discussing it. We're thinking about it. We're fulfilling the purpose of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem. And I think it's one of the most powerful moments of studying this cluster of poems, this anthology. I really do think it's one of the most powerful things. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600.